Welcome back after the break. We will now move forward to a panel discussion called Accelerating Research and Development Productivity Across the Biotech Landscape. And to chair this panel, we have Jane Dancer, Business Development Consultant from FSTAR. So hi Jane, I will now hand over to you for the short introduction and this exciting panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for the introduction, and also on behalf of all the panel, I'd like to thank you and the organising committee for allowing us to participate and contribute in this wonderful event, and also thank you so much for making it happen in these challenging times. Now, we just heard from Stefan Oschmann, and he talked at the beginning about how Merck, like many pharma, is working to address the challenges of COVID. And he also mentioned how that work has really made the public more aware of what the pharma industry does, and it's highlighted the challenges in bringing new therapies to the market, the very high costs, the time required, and the huge risks. So everyone's saying, when are we going to get a vaccine? And of course, as we all know who work in this industry, it does take an awful lot of effort. He also alluded to some of the regulatory challenges, and as new drugs emerge, we're forever striving for safer and more therapeutic, more efficacious therapeutics. And so this means that the hurdle that pharma companies face is ever increasing. So it's a tough business, but pharma isn't alone in these challenges. There are other sectors also based on exciting science that face similar issues. And like pharma, they have to constantly turn to innovation in order to be successful and competitive. So what we've done in this session is we've brought together some industry experts from a number of different sectors. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore the particular challenges that they face and how they are actually addressing these, and how opportunities emerge. And we'll see what we can learn from these experiences. Now, this is of particular interest to me. I spent the last 20 years actually working in pharmaceuticals, but I'm a plant scientist by training, and prior to that I spent 10 years in crop protection. So I moved from the discovery of medicines for plants into the discovery of medicines for humans, and I saw that there was a lot in common between the two. So I'm particularly interested to see what our panelists have to say about their own experience. So in a minute, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll move into some discussion, which I'll facilitate. And then after that, there'll be the opportunity for all of you to put your questions to the panelists. Now, I thought that there was a lot of very, very interesting questions to Stefan in the last section, so don't let us down. I hope you'll come back with giving us plenty to discuss. And then at the end, we'll just wrap up. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. And so David, if you could kick off and tell us a little bit about yourself, David Reece.
Well, thank you, Jane. I'm David Reece. I'm the head of research and development for Amgen, a large California biotechnology company. We focus on developing drugs in 3 broad areas: cardiometabolic diseases, oncology, and inflammation. I'm a medical oncologist by way of background, so trained in cancer biology and cancer medicine, had a career in academia at UCLA and the University of California, San Francisco, prior to moving into industry, and it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much, David. Wonderful to have you here, and I know David's up very early in the morning to be here with us, so thank you. And then on to Joanna, so from big biotech to smaller biotech. Joanna Holbrook, if you'd introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, I'm Jo. I lead research at a biotech called Cambridge Epigenetix. We call it KEGEX. It's a biotools and technology company which focuses on leveraging the power of epigenetics to revolutionize discovery and diagnosis and treatment of disease. We're at an exciting point right now. We're writing up results from a very large cohort study, evidencing the power of the epigenetic marks to pick up cancer in a blood sample. And we're also moving a research technology into development, which can discover multimodal epigenetic and genetic marks in a single workflow. By way of background, by training, I'm a molecular biologist. I did a PhD in molecular biology, but I've been working as a jobbing bioinformatician for the last 20 years. I was hired straight out of my PhD into GSK. I worked in the bioinformatics department of GSK, and then lastly in drug discovery and biomarker development, both in the UK and the US. So I was at GSK for 10 years. I then moved to Singapore. I was at Lilly for a short amount of time, and then back into academia, where I ran a research lab tracking disease using epigenomic markers in big cohort studies run out of the Singapore big national university hospitals. I was in Singapore for 5 years, and I moved back to the UK, took a professorship in bioinformatics at the University of Southampton. And I've been having an adventure in biotech for the last 3 years, first at Benevolent AI, using data and machine learning to do drug discovery faster and smarter, and most recently at Cambridge Epigenetix. Looking forward to the discussion, and nice to meet you all.
Thanks so much, Jo. So from bigger biotech to small biotech, and then across into the crop protection sector, as I said, something which I have a little bit of experience of, but it's 20 years since I've been out of it. So Dave Hughes is going to represent that part of the world.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Hughes. I work for Syngenta. So Syngenta is a large global multinational agricultural technology corporation, which essentially means that we provide some of the inputs that farmers use in order to produce their crops. So two particular types of input. The first one is chemicals, agrochemicals, mainly pesticides, but a few other things as well. So that part of the business is very much like a big pharmaceutical corporation. The other half of the business produces seeds, crop seeds that farmers grow, and that's a very different proposition. The name of the game there is all about the genetics of the seed, what genes are in there and how those genes are expressed, using everything from traditional breeding technologies that have been around for 10,000 years, all the way through to recombinant DNA technology and CRISPR and that sort of thing as well. The key thing about agricultural technology is it's diversifying, and no doubt we'll come back to this, but this makes it a very exciting place in which to work at this particular moment in time. Personally, I'm a synthetic organic chemist by background, so I did a chemistry degree, then a PhD, then a postdoc, and then I joined what was one of the Syngenta legacy companies in the chemistry department. So I worked as a chemist for 10 years, then I shifted to become a manager in a biology department, also in Syngenta, for 5 years. And then for the past 10 years, I've been a sort of an innovation manager, I suppose. So I've been interested in things like open innovation, external collaborations, technology scouting, technology foresight, that kind of thing. So that's been a lot of fun. So that's where I've come from.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dave. And last but not least, we have Niall. Now, up till now, we've been talking about the life sciences, and I'm particularly interested to hear what Niall's experience will be, because Niall is working in the industrial and energy sector. So Niall, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thanks very much, Jane. Hello, everyone. So I'm Niall Mottram. I head up what's called industrial and energy for a company called Cambridge Consultants. Cambridge Consultants, slightly misleadingly titled company, because what we do is we develop technology and then physically will make products on behalf of clients. And the clients for me cover a wide range of different sectors, everything from agritech, so the world that Dave's from, all the way through to energy generation and elements of construction as well. And actually across all of those different sectors, increasingly seeing that biotech has a place to play in bringing new innovation and actually disrupting the status quo in some of those mature sectors. Other thing worth pointing out about my employer is we create spin-out companies. And we've done so over the last 60 years of our history. Increasingly, those spin-out companies are of a biotech nature. The latest was a company called Epigenetix that has the ability to print DNA on demand. And I bring that up because obviously a lot of you on this call are kind of local to Cambridge. And indeed, it kind of shows how the world, even in my part of it, of industrial and energy, intersects with biotechnology in increasingly innovative ways. In terms of my background, I'm a chemical engineer. So I actually started my career in oil and gas. I used to work up in Aberdeen for Halliburton. Did that for a few years, came into the world of technology development, which then led me into biomedical engineering, actually, in biomedical design out in Boston and Massachusetts. So I lived out there for 3 years, came back to the UK 5 years ago, and then started transferring some of that knowledge into the role that I currently have now in industrial and energy. So I've kind of deliberately jumped around a bit, and that's because it's always interesting to kind of see how certain technology fundamentals can jump across different industries. Something that hopefully we'll touch upon as part of this panel.
Thank you very much, Niall. So thank you for all sharing your backgrounds. I'm sure that's giving people food for thought. Moving to David first. So working in a big biopharma company, maybe you could just kick off a very general question. So in your world, what are the biggest challenges that you face? How are you addressing them? And particularly, just picking up, Niall has talked about something which I hadn't thought of, the use of some of the technology for actually moving from industrial almost across into biopharm. So any convergence that you see, any surprising sort of sources of innovation that you and Amgen have tapped into?
Sure, thanks. It's a huge question. Let me frame it by saying, I think we have 2 or 3 existential challenges. The first is improving our success rates. It still remains the case that about 8% of drugs that go into clinical testing actually make it across the finish line. In other words, receive regulatory approval and are marketed. We have to do better than that success rate, which has been relatively constant for decades now. In addition, we have to reduce the cycle time. What do we mean by that? The time between conception of an idea in the laboratory and actually delivery of that drug to the market and to patients who need it. It's on average 12 to 14 years right now. If nothing else, that's simply no longer viable economically, given the large amounts of capital required to be deployed across that discovery and development spectrum. And finally, ensuring that the right patients actually get access to the drug globally at an affordable price for them, but at a price that also spurs innovation and provides an appropriate return on investment. So those are sort of big challenges. Now, one thing that's helping us, I think, is the point that was just brought out, which is we're seeing this massive convergence of many fields. And one of, I think, the interesting observations of this panel is none of us are doing really what we were trained to do. And I think that that's something that's simply going to accelerate in the future. In fact, I mentor a large number of young people, and one of the things I always tell them is there's really no such thing as a field anymore. We have an organic chemist now who is now supervising innovation on the panel after a trip through biology. And on and on. And so being open to new things, I think, will be a critical attribute because they're going to come at you very quickly.
Thanks, David. So picking up next, Joe, so you're working in a much smaller company. You face, I guess, similar sorts of challenges in terms of the risk, but in diagnostics, I mean, compared to therapeutics, would you say the risks and the cycle times and everything are lower?
Quite the opposite, actually. The reimbursement for diagnostics is famously quite low. But it's a very new field and a lot of things are not really very tested. So David referred a little to getting the medicine to the right patients. A large technical challenge exists there in terms of finding those patients. That requires new biomarkers. Most drugs do not work for most people they are prescribed for. And we're at the very infancy of being able to predict who the drugs will work for before those patients are subjected to side effects, are subjected to just waste of their time that they maybe can't afford. And so diagnostics, along with the precision medicine field, are starting to companion drugs. So we can get the right drugs to the right patients. How that's going to work economically is still also being worked out. There are technical challenges, but there are also organizational and economic ones. So I would say that for diagnostic development, we are probably taking higher risks, but the field is much more open. Information flow is tough for pharma and for biotechs. We know in pharma, often drug discovery programs start from scratch, even though we already have loads of GWAS hits, we've already knocked down genes in hundreds of disease models, we've already screened thousands, millions of compounds against thousands of targets. But because that data is held behind firewalls, because it's difficult technically to integrate, because there's IP considerations, drug programs start again. We need to avoid doing that in biomarker development, where again, there is omic technologies allow us to test millions of markers in every drop of blood. And we need to find ways to share that data between companies and between academic groups. And that should not only make us faster, but also reduce the costs of getting something new to market.
Can I just so the barriers to actually sharing data, are they regulatory, or are they more to do with sort of commercial competitive barriers?
There's some technical, both. I think in biomarker development, they're mostly technical and organizational. There's technical, it's just hard to integrate this type of data, to normalize it, to make it readable across platforms. And then organizationally, we're used to holding the data ourselves. We attach kudos to data creation rather than data integration and building new insights from it. We hold on to our data because we expect to get credited. And I think it's those organizational barriers that are the really tough ones. There is regulatory as well. Regulators expect you to produce new data to evidence the efficacy of your drug. But I think that is a lower hurdle in a way than getting into the habit of just sharing pre-competitive information.
Great, thanks, Jo. So I'm going to move on to Dave now, and I know that one of the things that's happened in ag in the 20 years or so since I left is that there is a huge amount of data available that's harvested, right from the field. So in your experience, Dave, I mean, do you face issues with sharing data? How do you use data? So just continuing that theme.
Yeah, yes, we do. There are lots of issues around it. I mean, the field is the best place to generate data in order to get an idea of what's going on in the real world. But there are privacy issues around farmers sharing their data. Farmers are very concerned about sharing their data with big corporations like us, for example, worried about what we might do with it. And they are concerned about other people having access to that data as well. So yes, certainly crop science is becoming extremely data rich in terms of the way that innovation is actually done, so that innovations can be tailored to specific circumstances in ways that they never have been in the past. And that's one of the really exciting mega trends, the rise of this digital agriculture to reduce impacts of food production. I would like to pick up one of the point that David raised. I mean, I mentioned that there's a high degree of analogy between what we do and what the pharmaceutical industry does, but there's one key difference that he alluded to, and that is that our failure rate in late stage development is very, very much lower. I think we hardly ever lose late stage development candidates. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we don't tend to work in model systems. We don't have the same ethical issues about working on human beings. So we can work on the real pest systems straight away. So in terms of efficacy, there is no question about efficacy of the technologies that we produce, because it's been defined by our testing regimes. So that's one great advantage that we have. There are some downsides to that, of course. Working on wild systems is actually really quite tricky. It's like the difference between working with a domestic puppy and a wolf, getting these things to be culturable and behave themselves, and weeds germinating as they should is really quite technically challenging. But it does have this huge advantage of the late stage failure rate being much lower. Another disadvantage that we have, of course, is that margins are much tighter in our field as well. So we don't have the amount of cash that tends to be available in the biomedical sciences. So there are pros and cons in what we do, but there's quite a high degree of analogy too.
Absolutely, even down to some of the targets even being similar. Biochemistry, sterols, yes. So yeah, no, thank you. So Niall, picking up on what you've just heard, I mean, maybe tell us a little bit more, because perhaps people aren't quite as familiar with the sector that you work in. And then, is there any commonality here with what you've heard the other panelists, Jo and Dave talk about?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned as part of my intro, I've got quite a broad remit, and I have kind of commercial oversight for activities in a range of different industries, from ag all the way through construction to energy. And within all of those, we generally see, or the parts I get involved in, is where there's disruption occurring. Whether that disruption is caused by external factors such as regulation or indeed funding of startups, that then changes the status quo. It causes those companies who are the incumbents to kind of have to change the way that they do things. And particularly interested how this pans out in both Dave and David's world, where there are increasingly lots of well-funded startups coming in and disrupting things. And the reason why I'm interested in that is, across all the companies I deal with, the main thing that they're interested in is efficiency. Whether it's efficiency for their R&D dollars, whether it's efficiency in actually getting to market, whether it's being able to reduce or improve, I should say, their end customers' efficiency. And so the interest in biotech is one of kind of promise in certain degrees. You know, if I take my involvement in things like ag tech, the promise of microbes and bacteria that can fix nitrogen and you attach it to a seed and, you know, improve yield is tremendous. But actually getting that to work at scale and having something that's stable and cost effective is pretty significant. And I'm obviously Dave will be able to comment on elements of that as much as he can. So I think it's really interesting just to note where you get that disruption from those kind of smaller, more agile startups and what it causes the bigger, more established players to do in terms of reacting in order to get that better return on R&D investment, because ultimately that's what every company, irrespective of their size, wants to achieve.
Yeah, so I think, David, maybe you could pick up on that. So Amgen, Big Pharma, used to be a small company, but has grown to, I don't know, tens of thousands of employees. So how do you work with biotechs or smaller companies? And
Sure. I mean, we work extensively with, you know, small biotechs. And if you look at our pipeline, roughly 50% of it is organically derived and 50% has been acquired or is taken forward in partnership. So there's a thriving global ecosystem right now. I think one of the features of the current landscape is this just tremendous ferment of activity. The 21st century has been called the biocentury. By some. I think that is, you know, indubitably true. And we're seeing just an explosion of innovation. And so the challenge for us is actually not finding innovation, but rather prioritizing. Where are the areas where you're going to focus? What are the areas that will be out of strategy? There is so much going on that no single organization can possibly do everything or even close. And so one of the key parts of my job is helping to determine where we'll focus.
so Joe, Dave, did either of you want to pick up on?
I could probably give you the other perspective because,
Yeah.
as you said, coming from the small agile, biotechs are very good at coming up with proof of concepts. Biotechs tend to have one or two ideas, so everything gets thrown at it, we pivot quick, and we come up with proof of concepts. But for us, and this is also, I think, true in academia, we don't have the resources to scale. We have something that works in our hands. To make that generalizable and scale, to have a technology that works in every lab, everyone's automation setups, everyone's cloud compute setups, or the diagnostic that works for every patient, cross geographies, ethnicities, comorbidities, that takes cash and it takes an organizational setup and multiple expertises. And so most biotechs and academia look for larger development partners. And I think the challenge for us is always when. Do you go at proof of concept stage where what you've got is an idea, maybe with a little bit of evidence that it will work, but not something that you could put a massive value on? Or do you try and get it as far as you can and look for the development partner later on? That's something I think there isn't a good practice for that yet. You seem to start the conversation a lot earlier than you would transition the technology. And I think that's partly because these different partners work at different cadences. There's a lot of development cycles in biotech, postdoc contracts in academia, and program prioritization in big companies as well. They might seem stable from the outside, but things quickly. Areas of science gets prioritized and deprioritized. So in my experience, these conversations themselves are quite unstable, as it takes a long time to come to agreement, but things around them move.
And perhaps, Dave, you know, you're someone who is very much in the front line of sourcing technology. I mean, the two things I think emerged from that. One, both David and Joe have mentioned about prioritization. You know, there's so much innovation out there. How, as a buyer of innovation, do you know what to bring in? And then perhaps, you know, your experience about actually, certainly in the ag area, you know, is there a thriving small startup scene that you can access?
Okay, let me take the second point first, because that's an easy answer. Yes, there is a very thriving innovation ecosystem in certain technology areas and not in others. You know, nobody is trying to invent new pesticides in either academia or in SMEs because it's so expensive to do so, and the relative rewards are relatively small. So that's not the sort of thing that these kind of businesses do. They tend to be innovating in new, potentially disruptive technology areas, as Niall was mentioning earlier on. But there's loads of them. It's a really exciting space to be in. And prioritization is a real headache, because, you know, there's almost an embarrassment of riches there. You can't play in every game. You've got to put some bets down on the table, right? And I think the way that we look at it, there's several ways in which we look at it. We look in at what sort of value that we can bring to a particular technology innovation, because there are some places in where, you know, there's not much we can do to help. We can generally offer scale and global reach, which is always going to be important for agricultural technologies, but there are some areas where you know, maybe that's not so relevant, perhaps, if you have some kind of niche product, perhaps. The way I try to prioritize is farmers are our customers, but farmers' choices are being defined by things further up the food chain, not least consumer values. So when I think about innovation around food, I ask, what is it that people actually value about their food? And how can innovation actually help that? So if I asked you, what is it that you value about your food? There's a long list of potential things, but three things tend to surface to the top. We value having enough food to eat. You know, we're a bit complacent about that sometimes, but, you know, you can see when COVID-19 hit, the mere hint of some kind of threat to the supply chain sent people sprinting to the supermarkets to buy dried food and tins and that kind of thing. So there's a great fear of not having enough food to eat. There's quality of the food, things like nutrition and safety and the sensory properties of our food that make it delicious to eat. So that's a whole bunch of quality criteria. And then there's the sustainability criteria, and minimizing the impact that our food production systems have on the wider environment. So when I'm looking at technologies, those are the three axes I tend to think about. What does it do for food quantity? What does it do for food quality? And what does it do to the sustainability of our agricultural systems?
Actually, you picked up something interesting there about your customers. I hadn't thought about myself, the consumer, being the customer rather than the farmer. I mean, maybe just pose that one to David. In pharma, who are your customers? Is it the doctors, the patients? Is it the reimbursers? Who do you have to really serve?
All of the above.
Okay.
You know, our most important customer is the patient, of course, and ensuring, as Joe said earlier, that the right patient gets the right drug at the right time. But for that to happen, it requires this gigantic, highly regulated apparatus. We like to say that we're the second most highly regulated industry on the planet, behind nuclear power.
Okay.
And, you know, so reaching physicians, having the appropriate discussions with regulators and working collaboratively with them, and then, of course, working with payers around the globe, where there are many, many different healthcare systems and an incredibly varied environment. So, of course, we have armies of people devoted to all of these areas, many of which are actually a field or fields unto themselves. So, you know, who is the customer? It's all of the above, and it depends on what moment in time you're talking about.
Maybe Niall, do you want to pick that? Who are your customers when you're innovating?
Oh, it's almost the first question that we ask our clients is how can they define that, and particularly with the startups, trying to kind of focus in on exactly how they will deliver benefit if they can identify exactly who benefits from their, and it's not exactly the person that they sell to. And the term that we typically use when we're doing that, once you've kind of identified who it is that benefits, what does that mean from a technical perspective, an R&D perspective, is MVP. And for the people who are in the US, I don't mean most valuable player here. I mean minimum viable product.
Yeah.
And you know, what is the system, the architecture that delivers what you need to do, but doesn't have all the bells and whistles and the cherry on top of the cake that sometimes companies can get distracted with. What delivers the really critical benefit to your customer, and don't ever get distracted by that. And that can be a challenge, particularly if you have what potentially could be a game-changing platform technology that some biotech technology presents. You can suddenly think, well, I could do this, and this. Focusing in on that MVP and nailing that and getting that successfully to market is typically the biggest challenge for most of the companies that I work with.
Yeah, we've actually got some questions coming in. So let me start picking up some of these, and this one relates a bit to customers in the broadest sense, so public perception, adoption of new technologies and products. So what type of investors, what type of investments are your companies making to improve public perception and the adoption of the technologies and products? And probably maybe I'll start with Dave on this one and then open up to the rest of you, because I know that, David, you said that pharmaceuticals are the most highly regulated industry after nuclear power. I just wonder how highly regulated crop protection products are. Certainly when I worked there was an awful lot of regulation involved in that. But public perception was another issue. How's all that going, Dave, and what are you doing to address it?
Well, to be completely honest, we historically have been extremely bad at this. And so we're in the position where we are essentially trying to dig ourselves out of a hole. It all went really badly wrong around genetically modified crops in the 1990s. And the perception of the whole industry is tainted by that, I think. You know, regardless of the fact that the concerns that were raised about genetically modified crops at the time, none of those things have turned out to be true. It was more a perception of arrogance of industry about the way that the technology was actually introduced, that people caused, you know, the big backlash against that. So, so how do you get yourselves out of that kind of hole? Well, you need to develop trust with the public. But that is really very difficult to do. It's a long game to play, and trust is very difficult to establish, but very easy to lose. And so the sort of things that we're trying to do is place sustainability in its broadest context right front and center of Syngenta's strategy now, right at the very top levels of the company. Almost everything we do is now focused on sustainability in that kind of context. So we've got this thing called the Good Growth Plan that's now in its second iteration, where we make some very specific numerical promises, if you like, about the sort of things that we're going to try to do over the next, I think it's 5 to 7 years or so, how much we're going to invest in new sustainable technologies, what those technologies are going to do for things like biodiversity and climate change and all of those kind of things. And this is all externally audited, so that, you know, people can hold our feet to the fire, if you like, and say, okay, you know, you said you were going to do this, but you fell short. What are you going to do about it next time? And so in the past, I think maybe 20 years ago, we would have shied away from all of that and just try to keep our head below the parapet and hope that other players in the market were taking more stick than we would. Not anymore. Now we're taking a more proactive stance in trying to show that what we can do, the innovations that we produce, actually have greater societal benefit.
Thanks. I mean, same question to you, Niall. You know, you talked about some of the innovations you're working on using DNA for data storage. That could all be fairly scary to the public, couldn't it? So is this something that you have to address as well, bringing the public with you?
Yeah, there definitely has to be that kind of messaging from the start. And more often than not, it's, you know, the question of what's in it for me, and putting yourself in the shoes of Joe Public, and how they'll perceive something and how they'll perceive the benefit. Because if you can take them along the journey as to how the benefit changes their lives and make things better for them, they're generally less concerned as to the absolute technical detail as to how it was achieved. I'm sure, the general public, when a COVID vaccine happens, if indeed it happens, they won't care exactly how it was generated in the lab. They just want to know the end benefit is provides vaccine. So there's a little bit of that in pretty much all the different projects that I get involved in. So the one that you cited is a great example. So this is a company called Catalog Technologies, who have the ability to store data in DNA. Now, why is that even interesting? Well, given the sheer amount of data that we're creating as a race every single day, we'll very quickly run out of actual ways of being able to store it without burning all the fossil fuels in the world to try and keep data centers around the globe, keeping things cool and storing the data that is within those data centers. And moreover, you need to find a way of storing mission critical data in a format that is very sustainable for decades, centuries, and also is something that's very difficult to hack into. Because Lord knows there's plenty of us who have found a credit card being cloned, or someone who's managed to hack into some part of our personal data. So you can immediately see benefits to individuals. You've got data in a way that is more environmentally friendly because it doesn't require a data center and all the energy that goes with the data center. You have a medium that is intrinsically safe. You can't really hack into DNA unless you've got some very, very sophisticated tools, and you then have to have first-hand access to it. So when you start kind of talking around the technology and the benefits in that way, people don't really so much ask about the how, because they're more convinced about why it helps them.
David, Joe, did you want to add anything on? I mean, the public perception of pharma, as we said, has, I think, gone up with COVID and made people much more aware of the need for therapeutics. Any reflections at all?
Go ahead, Joe.
I think we need public trust to do our work. As Dave was saying, privacy is very important in ag research. It's also very important in clinical research. To do any kind of clinical research, you have to ask participants with their incredibly sensitive medical information. And so you have to talk about the promise of what you're doing, what's in it for me, as Niall says. One thing that's been a challenge for me is, honestly, not by design. I've worked on a lot of hype technologies during my career. I've worked on GWAS, I've worked on molecular evolution, omics, machine learning, liquid biopsy. All of them have been very much at the top of the hype cycle. And honestly, I was just interested in them. But there's, I think, a bit of a fatigue and a bit of a skepticism when you hear this new great technology is going to solve everything. And of course, none of them do. They all contribute to something and push up more challenges. And so I find talking to our ultimate customers, to patients, but also talking to investors and talking to our more proximal customers, the beta testers, the clinical researchers, the basic researchers that are going to use our technologies, that we have to be very careful to contextualize the promise. We're always saying this is something that is going to help, but it's not something that's going to solve everything. And I think we have been guilty in the past of overhyping. And COVID is a very good example of why we can't do that. We're not going to get a safe vaccine in the next month. And I think people are seeing that played out in real time, which can only be for the good.
The next question, I'm going to put this on to you, David, before the others, and that relates to actually open innovation. So this touches on a few things we've talked about. Obviously, COVID, we've seen a lot of collaboration there. Joe mentioned earlier about access to data, where competition as well as patient confidentiality can raise barriers. So in terms of open innovation at Amgen, how much are you involved in open innovation to actually facilitate your own research?
Quite a bit. I would say much more than you might suppose. So we are involved in a number of what we call pre-competitive consortia. So these are collaborations where with often industry, academia, and government together, we are generating bodies of knowledge that everyone can use, but that are not proprietary, and often those are open. There's a great example in the UK Biobank, which has 500,000 citizens who have contributed biologic material, have follow-up, and has been used to make a number of important discoveries about human disease. We're participating in a specific consortium that will do whole genome sequencing on the entire cohort. So it'll be the largest collection of whole genomes in the world when that is completed. There are 3 or 4 industry participants, the UK government, Oxford, and others all participating, and those data will be open access after they're generated. So quite a bit. And at the other end, after we generate data from clinical trials, much of it now will ultimately go into public data repositories at the patient level after being appropriately anonymized to ensure security. And there are now ways that are well worked out in order to do that.
Dave, Niall, did you want to say anything about how pre-competitive research and open innovation impacts on your areas?
Sure, yeah, I can go first. So I mentioned I've been doing this sort of innovation management role for about 10 years or so now. That was the point at which Syngenta really started to take external collaboration seriously as a core part of our innovation strategy, realizing that many of the things that we wanted to do, we simply weren't set up to do by ourselves. We lacked the skills, we lacked the resources in order to do that. And so I've kind of been on this journey right from the very beginning in terms of what Syngenta has been doing. So we have a team of about, must be about 20, 25 of us around the world that's designed to facilitate that kind of thing. And we manage, well, it's at least 500 different collaborations with either academic institutes or other companies around the world. So a whole variety of different things that we're doing right across the R&D spectrum. It's a bit difficult to count actually, because in a big organization like Syngenta, there are little pools of budget all over the place that are often used to fund these kind of collaborative activities. So actually counting them and working out exactly what a big company is doing is actually quite a significant challenge. So it's at least 500, probably quite a lot more. And so, yeah, as I said, this is now a core part of our strategy, especially in new areas, new disruptive areas where we don't simply have any skills or experience in-house. This is essentially the only way in which it can be done, is through collaboration. And that's why it's such an exciting place in which to work, I think.
I kind of echo that. So I'm maybe from the other side of the fence when it comes to the open innovation stuff, because I'm typically part of one of the companies that might be called on as part of these partnerships. And I think it's really heartening to see how organizations, because of the level of disruption in the industry, recognize that they can't go it alone. And also that there's certain technologies that it doesn't make sense to build in-house capability on, because you're only going to dip in and out of it. So whether that might be tapping on elements of AI to help with part of the development process of a new biotech, or indeed elements of the engineering skills that help scale up the biology. And I'll kind of go my own personal background here. So I started off training as a chemist when I was at university. And then into my second year, I decided to change to chemical engineering, because it was the kind of commercialization of the chemistry that really interested me, rather than being at the bench tinkering with the chemistry. And so you can sometimes, particularly within the world of biotech, there can be a lot of focus on the science aspect of that, the biology. And one of the big challenges is, how do you then marry that with the engineering that allows things to scale commercially and maybe improve the success ratio in doing so. And those skills are complementary, but it's rare for one company to have both. So kind of working out who provides what parts of it. So maybe academia is on the very sharp side of the R, if you like, on the research bit, but academia would never, well, should never admit that it's going to be the entity that would do the commercialization and the scale, because that's a different skill set. And the two are complementary, which is why the right kind of open innovation program should bring those together to mutual benefit.
We've actually got an interesting question, and it's someone obviously who's interested in medical device innovation, and they say that rapid prototyping is very key in developing medical devices. And the question is in drug discovery, but I'd also say in ag and in your area, Niall, is there a sort of rapid prototyping concept which allows you to increase the efficiency of your own processes?
I think there's a couple of bits there. So if I go back to that example around the DNA storage, the complementary technology that really unlocked that was inkjet printing, and that sounds like quite a leap. You know, going from how do you store data in DNA to going, well, the inkjet printer is the solution to make it commercially viable. So you only get those kind of links if you've got different partners involved who have kind of got the fingers in lots of different pies, who can kind of make that link and go, hey, actually the fundamental technology performance you require isn't something you need to do brand new. It actually comes from over there, and you can kind of transfer that across. So that's a form of kind of rapid prototyping without having to reinvent the wheel. Someone else in another industry might have actually cracked part of it for you. You just need to be aware of where to look, and that's, you know, that's not trivial, and that's why these kind of partnerships work. But that's my personal experience of how you kind of do the rapid prototype in a biological sense.
So prototyping through partnerships. David, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I would say preclinically, you know, we now, using a wide variety of technologies, can rapidly screen through medicines, or candidate medicines in a much more efficient fashion than we used to, using high throughput screening, for example, and other techniques. Now, when you get to human testing, we can't do the analog of devices or tech. We can't generate a new iPhone equivalent every 12 to 18 months. Simply the preclinical safety studies required to introduce a drug into humans mandate, of course, going a little bit slower. There are some ways to speed that up. One can do, for example, microdosing studies. If you have a question about the pharmacokinetic properties of a drug, how it's going to be absorbed, distributed, metabolized, one can do more rapid studies, and if it fails, then you're done. And it's important to get that answer as quickly as possible. But just by its very nature, testing in humans is and should be a little bit slower.
Sure. Dave, anything to add from your perspective? So prototyping, you've already talked about the risk, the success in the later stage being higher than for the pharma industry, but are there certain phases in your drug discovery, in your processes, discovery and development, where you look for a sort of prototyping approach?
Not so much. I think I'm pretty much in the same park as David, actually. I would echo a lot of what he said in his previous answer. One thing that we're doing much more of now than we ever did before is modeling, in silico modeling of properties of things like molecules, and that's leading, of course, into the use of artificial intelligence to help us design molecules in a better, more efficient way. And I'm sure Joanna's got quite a lot of experience with that when she was at Benevolent. So yeah, I think that's a particularly exciting area at the moment. Doesn't really answer the question. I don't think we do the rapid prototyping bit, but that kind of mindset is still prevalent in certain areas of technology development.
Another question, I mean, this question goes back to data in some ways, so it's a question for pharma biotech, but perhaps Dave and Niall will also have a perspective. So has the large scale availability of genomics data accelerated research or slowed it down because there are now just such a vast number of new targets to be validated? And I think this sort of speaks to, David, what you were saying earlier about the need for prioritization, because there just are so many opportunities out there. But specifically regarding targets, have we got too many now?
No, we never have too many targets, but I might broaden the question out, because I think it touches on something that I think is absolutely critical to success in the coming few decades. And one of the things that we've embedded across the R&D organization at Amgen is the notion that this is a period of time when human data will transform what we do, from genomics and other omic technologies, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, through large-scale clinical data sets, and then at the other end, real-world evidence. So aggregating massive amounts of evidence from electronic medical records, for example, in an appropriate fashion, and other data sources. And it's really the convergence of all of that data and our ability to analyze it, which I think is going to really provide deep insights into human diseases, their response to therapies, how different types of patients and subsets of patients will differentially benefit from therapy. So we're right on the precipice of a very, very fundamental change. And the challenge now is one of aggregation, storage, and then fundamentally analysis of these data. Because with such huge data sets, the one thing you can do is find all sorts of interesting stuff. And a small fraction of it will even be true. And it's understanding which parts are true that I think is the real challenge.
I very much agree with that. It's not slowed it down, but I don't think we've seen the benefit as quickly as we hope. Again, the hype cycle. And that's because, as David says, we don't have the way of integrating the data, analysing it, picking out the truth from what is at the moment a bit of a sea of false positives. And so we will get there with the extra layers of analytics that we'll need. What these big omic data sets are giving you is a complete data set. Whilst before we would go in with a hypothesis-driven experiment, go look at this one target, generate a bit of data around there. And it was very difficult to cross-compare with target validation data on another target, which we've done different experiments on. Now we're doing the kind of experiments in humans, as well as in translatable models, where you can start cross-comparing between targets. So we'll be able to rank, and we'll be able to integrate across data sets. So in that huge sea of false positives, which is human genetic data, we'll be able to pull out causal pathways with the integration of omics data, transcriptomics, proteomics, epigenomics, super important to integrate genetics and environment. And our rapid prototyping is functional genomics. We can now knock down multiple targets and look at the effect of that within the same model systems. And I could also point out, as David says, that being able to integrate clinical data and real world evidence will allow us to rapidly prototype as well in clinic. Yes, we absolutely have to run the slow experiments at the end, but we can go ask, okay, if you modulate this system, do you see a phenotyping response that would support that hypothesis? So it's already sped it up, not as fast as everyone hoped, as is normal, but with the analytics, we should see a step change. Biology is becoming a data science, and we will start from the data from now on.
I think from my point of view, the genetics revolution has a profound impact in agriculture for several reasons. First of all, crop protection, pest control is a massively multi-species problem. So you've got things like people eating the food, you've got the crop, you've got a whole range of species in the environment that you don't want to control, and a huge number of pest species in the environment that you do want to control. So the challenge is really finding a substance or some kind of intervention which will kill the organisms that you want to control and be completely harmless to everything else. And so the genetics revolution there, you can see how that might be useful, right? I mean, looking for targets which only actually exist in the pest species and don't exist anywhere else is obviously a pretty good place to start. And building on that now, using RNAi as an in-field intervention for pest control, you can see how that was going as well. That actually works for some species, not for others. Confusingly, we don't fully understand why that is the case, but certainly for certain pest species, it's a very effective therapy indeed. The other obvious area, I think I mentioned it right at the very start, is understanding how our crop plants work, and therefore how you can make interventions in the genome of crop plants in order to improve their traits and their properties. And that's another huge area. It's a bit like the human genetics problem in pharmaceuticals, but of course, the crop plant is our patient rather than the human being.
Thanks, Dave. And Niall, so data analytics, actually being able to sift through it and to, as Joe was saying, to kind of distinguish between the hype and where the real value is.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's gone before. There is a fundamental difference between information and insight. And an awful lot today, people just confuse having a huge amount of information, huge amount of data, as somehow having insight. And the competitive differentiation for companies in every sector is that ability to know what to look for. So just because you've got a huge data lake or a data ocean as it is now, doesn't mean that you're automatically at a better advantage. You've got to know what to look for and how to do it. And again, the techniques and skills that allow a company to process a data ocean and get to something much more tangible and specific is slightly different to the skills that were advantageous 20, 30 years ago. So I'd absolutely agree that those companies who know what it is that they have to look for have the advantage, and then it's a case of working out how you then go about getting that analytics into something that is delivering tangible benefit.
Right, and that actually sort of leads a bit into another question we've been asked, which is with new developments, and I think here it means, with a lot of really exciting and sort of cutting edge innovation, the gaps for tech transfer might be becoming wider. So how are you guys working to ensure that these gaps disappear for developing countries? So I think that means, how do you actually bridge the gap between the real innovation and the purposes that we've been talking about? How do you actually identify so I think cutting edge innovation, so how do you actually work out what the value is for what you're doing? I think that's what the question means. If anyone else wants to have a go at it, please help me.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, right. So yeah, this is quite a big question, really. I mean, because agriculture is so diverse across the globe, and people everywhere need to eat food, right? And almost people everywhere need to produce food too. And so working out what technology is appropriate in what market is actually quite a challenge. So what works well in Brazil, which is a developing world country, but agriculture is very high tech there, is very different to what's going on in China, for example, which is another kind of developing world country which is going through this massive shift at the moment. And Africa, again, it's a very different sort of environment. And so you have to make sure that the technologies that you develop are appropriate for the markets in which they're intended to be used. So Africa remains the biggest challenge, I think, for me. I think companies like Syngenta sell their goods almost everywhere else, but our market in Africa is really pretty low, primarily because many of the technologies that we develop can't necessarily be parachuted into those kind of agronomic environments and create value. So the fundamental economic model around agricultural technologies is that they increase value for the farmer more than the cost of actually buying the technologies in the first place. So they increase yield, and that the value of that increased yield more than pays for the price of buying the technology. Whereas in places like Africa, that paradigm is not necessarily true, because access to markets, for example, is cannot be taken for granted. So that remains a difficult situation, to my mind, that we haven't cracked yet. That said, though, a lot of what we're saying in the sustainability space does focus on smallholder agriculture and working out how we can create value for them, not necessarily with huge high-tech stuff, but low-tech improvements on where they are at the moment could well add significant value. And so that's the kind of direction of our thinking, I believe.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave, for helping with the question. We've just got to the final part of the Q&A. We've got a number of questions which relate to sort of human capital. So first of all, what are the traits and experience you look for in big pharma biotech for PhDs that are thinking about transitioning from academia into industry? So I think here your own life stories perhaps have inspired people to think about their own careers, but also you're all, I'm sure, working in recruiting and building companies. So Who wants to pick that one up first? What do you look for in PhDs who are moving from academia to your particular industry, your company?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll give it a shot to start. First of all, I have looked less and less over time at what someone knows in order the body of knowledge, and rather at the underlying substrate. What are the qualities that they have? Are they able to grow? Do they have the curiosity that is just critical to enable them to learn and master new bodies of knowledge? I like them to be an expert in something, but not so much because of what they know about that, but because that's a marker of someone who is able to master a body of knowledge and then apply it. One of my favorite books, it's on the bookshelves behind me here, is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And there's a character in David Copperfield, Mr. Macabre, who's one of Dickens' great comic creations. And now we would diagnose Mr. Macabre almost certainly with bipolar disorder. He has periods of clear mania where he's financially irresponsible, winds up periodically in debtor's prison, becomes depressed. And then as he starts to come out of his depression, he utters what is his signature line, "Something will turn up." And I'm interested in people who are able to capitalize on that something when it turns up. And I would say in my own career, I've been the tremendous beneficiary of a complete lack of planning. I never sat down and said, in 2 years, I'm going to be doing this, in 5 years, I'm going to be doing this, in 10 years, I'm going to be doing that. But things turned up, and it's the ability to sort of recognize that and then give everything you've got. That's the quality I'm really looking for in people who I think will have a shot at being a long-term leader or highly productive member of one of our teams.
Yeah, if I could build on that and absolutely echo it. When I'm recruiting in my team, the thing that we sometimes refer to as having people who are T-shaped. So if the vertical part of the T is the industry expertise, knowing a lot about a particular area, the horizontal part of that T is being able to apply it in multiple different scenarios and multiple different industries. I think everyone on this call is kind of a reflection of that T-shape. We've jumped around industries and we leverage our kind of our core, but it's not to the point where you're an expert in just a single thing, because that's perhaps not terribly appropriate in the 21st century. It's the ability to adapt and jump to new opportunities and seize them. That's the thing that's perhaps more important in the knowledge economy that we now have.
I think just to build a little bit further on that, I think the ability to work in multidisciplinary teams is critically important these days. You've got to be able to communicate with people from different disciplines. You have to have a common language and understand what they're saying, and they need to be able to understand you. So I think David at the very beginning said there's no such thing as being a specialist in a specific field anymore. It's much fuzzier than that these days. But this interdisciplinary nature of science is, well, it's a mega trend that is almost certainly going to continue, I'm sure. Maybe I'm the epitome of that, because I've kind of gone in reverse in my field. I started out fancying myself as an expert in chemistry, then moved into biology, and I'm knowing less and less about more and more as my career goes ahead. I'm not an expert in anything at all anymore, but I know a little bit about quite a wide range of different fields. And so being able to pull different bits together from disparate parts of science and technology is actually a reasonably useful skill. It's serving me quite well anyway. So it's not necessary to be a deep expert and forever burrow deeper and deeper and deeper into a single discipline in order to have a good scientific career. I
agree with part of that, but I also really disagree with part. So I think you're right that communication is really important, and almost across different places to work, that's differently important. So I would say in academia, you can have a career where you're a deep expert and you talk to other deep experts in your field. In pharma, you collaborate across disciplines, but most of the important people in your life are still other scientists. You're working with other scientists from different disciplines on a program. Something I notice in biotech is actually only some of the important people in my life are other scientists. I spend a lot of time talking to non-scientists, to the business side of the organisation, to the financial side. And so I've had to learn to communicate to different groups and at different levels of detail. I would, though, disagree that you do still need to be an expert in something, as David said. I think I'd always advise people not to generalise too quickly. I think it's important to embrace the complexity and really understand one thing, that not only is something that is transferable across fields, you will see parallels, but also gives you the grounding and the confidence to transfer, knowing that at least you did grasp one thing completely, and allows you to be humble in other fields. So I say yes, look for the potential to cross fields, but make sure you know one thing well.
Okay, thank you. So this is on a similar theme, and I think you've all talked about how you've crossed into different fields, different areas, and then the question is really what's helped you to adapt and catch up if you needed to when you switched from one field to another. So having all agreed that moving around is a good thing, that we need to be T-shaped, is it a problem actually moving into a different field and being credible, perhaps? How do you do that?
Yeah, you need humility, because all of us, we get invested in being an expert in something, and to move, you have to be prepared to ask stupid questions. And I think you can adapt a lot faster if you're prepared to show your ignorance. So I think the top quality is humility if you're attempting to move fields.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And certainly, being in human drug development is a daily exercise in humility with a success rate of 8%. But, to me, the critical quality is being willing to learn new things. And to me, that's been the most rewarding part of my career. When I was in medical school, if you told me you'd be working in biotechnology, the first thing I would have said is, what's that? The field had literally just been born a year or two early. No one had ever heard of it. And those sorts of changes will come over the next decades. But also don't discount the real importance of fun and having fun. And to me, learning new things in new areas is fun. So moving into industry and then beginning to lead teams stretched me in ways that were very, very different from leading my much smaller clinical research group or laboratory group in academia. Not better, just different. And again, learning the business side of biotech, has been immensely rewarding. So and just that openness to learning new things and having fun while you're doing it, I think are critically important.
Just one observation from my switch from the world of plants to the world of patients was that the one thing I found perhaps most difficult was that it was a completely different community of people. I had a very strong network in crop science, and then when I moved into pharma, it was having to build a new family, new relationships, and perhaps the edges are a bit more blurred these days, but that was the one thing that surprised me, that I probably found most difficult. So one last question, and then we'll move to the wrap up. And this is a fairly general question for each of you. So what advice would you give to aspiring biotech leaders, so the leaders of tomorrow who are listening, as to how innovation could be managed better? Who wants to have a crack at that first?
Okay, I'll have a go. I mean, I think innovation is all about creating value. You have to understand how you're creating value, and then couple that value creation up with some kind of business model to enable you as the innovator to capture a bit of the value that your technology is creating. That's kind of how it works. My advice, I think, would be is to do this via collaboration. It seems to be by far the most effective way of doing it, pulling all of the pieces together, not necessarily in one single organization, but just it's accessing what you need rather than owning what you need is the crucial part of this, I think. So that's the kind of mindset that I think is required for innovation moving forward in the future.
Yeah, if I could echo that, you know, the question said, how can you do innovation better? That implies that it's not being done well today, and I would disagree with that. I think innovation is actually being done blooming well right now, and you can see that actually in the way that, whether it's companies or countries, the way that the pandemic has kind of forced innovation and has broken down certain barriers. You know, there's been tremendous progress made in, you know, a matter of months. You know, this is a virus and a pandemic that has still only been with us for 8-9 months, but we're making amazing progress, and there's entities who have come together that previously would have never done so. You know, I'm part of a company that was part of the many different groups that were involved in the UK ventilator challenge, for example, and it was great to see, you know, companies just kind of get together for, you know, the common good and do things because they had the right mindset. So I think, you know, how can innovation be done better? It is linked to that mindset, that growth mindset, being open to trying new things and open to failure. You will learn more from your mistakes than you will from your successes. And you know, the challenge with some elements of biotech is, you know, just how long it takes to get to that point when you know it's failure, because that can be a stretch, and it can feel, you know, pretty disheartening when that happens. So kind of being resilient and being open to that, I think, is part of the key parts to keep innovation being as good as it is today, rather than having to make it better.
David, Joe, have you any thoughts on making innovation even better?
I think that the collaboration that we've seen on COVID-19 is a model for the future. And here, it's not just between companies, but between, you know, what I like to call the three legs of the stool: industry, academia, and government. You see them working together by necessity in a way that has enabled rapid progress. Still much to do, of course. The question is, what can we take away from that? Are those models for the future that we should adopt for the long term? And I think there are many, many lessons that we can learn from the pandemic in that regard.
Right, we're almost out of time. So just to wrap up, I'd like each of you, perhaps in just 1 or 2 sentences, to give you what you think is the key message that you'd like the leaders of tomorrow to take with them away from this session and from the summit in general, in any particular order. So whoever wants to go first.
Oh, let me try.
Go ahead. Have a go, Neil.
So I think there's 3 parts to my kind of closing part. Is yeah, I'm fortunate in many ways that I get to look across lots of different industries, and I'm fascinated, coming from a chemical engineering background, as to where biotech is now relevant. It's not just in the traditional industries, if you like, for biotech. I see companies in construction using microbes to generate alternatives to concrete. I see companies storing data in DNA. I see ag tech companies coming up with amazing ways to fix nitrogen and increase crop yield. Biotech is relevant across almost every industry, if you look at it. And that's tremendously exciting for those people who are actively training in it and fascinated in that sector. And linked to that is the fact that you can then do that technology transfer from those different industries, because biotech is now increasingly industry agnostic. You can take principles from one part and apply it to solve a problem in another area. And you'll do that successfully through the third part of my closing message, through collaboration, through, you know, getting the right people around the table, virtual or otherwise, to try and bring those technologies to fruition and fully commercialize it. So it's those 3 parts: relevance in lots of industries, the technology transfer that comes with that, and the ability to collaborate with the right partners to make it happen.
Great. Well, perhaps I can go next. So we've talked from our perspective about human disease and intervening against human disease. Let me leave our attendees with one thought. Healthcare systems around the world are generally constructed on a break it and fix it model. You get a problem and we then deal with that problem. The challenge for this generation and for our audience is to move us to a predict and prevent model. How can we predict who is likely to get diseases and intervene, whether that's with a drug, lifestyle modification, or other means to prevent the disease from occurring to begin with. That's actually much more cost effective in general, and of course, pays immense benefits in terms of human health. So the challenge for this generation is, how do you transition us from a centuries-old model in healthcare of break it and fix it to an era of true predict and prevent?
So if you want to predict and prevent, you should work in epigenomic biomarkers as a way to predict disease, predict the interaction of your genetics and your environment on your health, and to measure intervention efficacy before it gets to phenotype. But more general comment, congratulations, this is a fantastic field you've chosen. It's a really good time to launch a career. Pick something you're really interested in. Don't worry if it's early and risky. You're not choosing for the rest of your life. You will transfer fields and you'll take what you've learned with you. Make sure you take the people, as Jane says, with you as well. Keep your connections with the people you work with. Keep visiting appointments, keep advisory positions. Just make sure you send them a note on LinkedIn. It's a really small world. Everyone comes back again. And I think we spend a lot of the time making sure we're working with quality people, with people for which we can collaborate with quickly. And then I would say, look for opportunities to do something concrete and real in that space. Don't generalize too quickly. Don't become a technology evangelist or a futurist. Find something that could be genuinely useful. Get into the technical and the organizational details. You'll need to humbly deal with both of those to get to be part of something that's real. Even if you don't get all the way to market, as we talked about, most things don't. You'll have made a real contribution and you'll have those learnings to apply to the next big thing.
Great, thanks, Jo. And I'm conscious that we're eating into the networking session. So Dave,
Okay.
Your final comments.
Right, very, very quickly then. I'll just echo what some of the others have said. I think that now has never been a more exciting time to be a scientist. You know, the world is in a real mess right now. We've got things like food security concerns, resurgence of infectious disease, we've got ballooning chronic diseases, climate change, biodiversity collapse, overconsumption of resources, pollution. All of these things represent opportunities for intervention to make the world a better place. And on the other hand, we've got this huge amount of new science and technology that's being developed right now, which could represent solutions to some of those problems. So what we really need is smart people in the middle, connecting this solution space to this problem space. And which is why I think it's just so exciting at the moment. So for those of you about to embark on that kind of career, I wish you all the very best of luck, because frankly, the world needs it right now.
Great. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you also to the panelists for those fantastic contributions, thoughts, plenty to take away from this. I'm now going to hand over to Robert, who's going to host the networking session, I think.
Thank you so much to all the members of this panel, and then because you can't thank yourself, thank you so much, Jane, for chairing this session. It's really excellent and an inspiring moment for our leaders of tomorrow.